Today, I'm going to talk about online platforms, right? Which I guess the title of the talk gives a hint of the content, right? But like Wikipedia, YouTube, Facebook, Tinder, you name it, online platforms. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but they play a central role in our lives, and the way that they moderate, recommend, and monetize content mediates these platforms' benefits, but also their harms. And today I'm going to talk about research that can improve those platforms and hopefully, in doing so, also improve society at large. But before going there, I want to take a step back and propose that we all imagine what would happen if this platform suddenly disappeared, right? And I guess it would disrupt our economies, right? People buy and sell stuff all the time on Amazon. I'm actually impressed with how well Amazon works in the US, frankly, having just moved here. They order food on Uber Eats, and we all watch movies on Netflix and so on. It would also disrupt communities that play important roles in people's lives. Many of us wouldn't be up to date with the latest papers on Twitter or Blue Sky or X or Mastodon, not to mention subreddits and Facebook groups dedicated from all sorts of interests, right? From hiking to growing cactuses. And imagine how hard it would be to learn anything, to learn Bayesian statistics, or how to remove oil stains from clothes, or to figure out who won the World Cup in 1994. All of that without Wikipedia or YouTube or Coursera, it'd be very hard, right? And I could go on and on here. But the point is that these platforms are deeply embroidered into our social fabric. And in that context, it's not surprising that these platforms are also deeply connected to some of the biggest societal challenges of the 21st century. Social media, for example, has played a crucial role in radicalizing people for extremist ideologies. In this 2019 paper, for example, we show that many users in the late 2010s went from consuming contrarian influencers on YouTube to explicitly white supremacist content. And radicalization is not the only concern here. I guess we're all well aware of the potential harms these platforms can bring to our information ecosystem and to our mental health. But platforms are not immovable rocks that we should accept as they are. They're social technical systems that can be tweaked and adjusted. And I guess that's what this series is about, partially, right? Of talks. And as a society, my argument is that we should try to maximize the benefits and minimize the goals of the harms of these platforms. And during my doctorate, and this is kind of like this presentation mostly relates to work that I did during my PhD. I advanced towards this goal through research that aims to understand the causal effect of content curation practices. And let me unpack that because there's a lot here, right? So the first thing is curation practices. And this is really an umbrella term I'm using to a lot of things that platforms do, right? And what platforms mostly do is to curate, right? Users on these platforms, they upload images, they list products to sell, they make profiles, and platforms essentially curate these products and serve it to other users also on these platforms. And there are some key ways in which platforms curate. They determine what to recommend to user, what content to keep and what content to remove, and they determine how to share revenue with users. And an important point here is that if we understand how these curation practices shape online platforms, we can try to improve them. Because, recommended systems can be tuned and moderation and monetization policies can be adjusted and tweaked. And my work on this has been published in mostly in CS conferences and also in general interest journals alongside folks from industry and other academic institutions, right? And perhaps most important, I'm very happy that it has had some real world impact, right? It has shaped the public debate, appearing in over 100 news pieces from El País to NBC News, and in reports by think tanks, and has informed products in companies like Meta and Reddit, right, that are used by a bunch of people. But let's get back to understanding the causal effect of content creation practices here, right? Because to understand how research like my own can improve online platforms, we need this key second concept, which is causality. You see, descriptive work delineates correlations. This is very important because it allows us to understand what the world is like currently. And this is, for example, what I showed in that 2019 paper. We answered a descriptive question. Did users transition to more radical content on YouTube, right? But ultimately, to improve online platforms, we have to ask, what if? We must understand what would happen if we changed something, if we flipped some switch. And for example, in more recent work, which has appeared at PNAS, we answered a related question that goes on this what if direction, which is if users blindly follow the algorithm, will they be exposed to more radical content, right? And surprisingly, for instance, we found evidence that this is not the case. The algorithm is not the main driver towards radical content. But in any case, the point here is that answering the first question allows us to understand what's going on in online platforms. But the second one allows us to understand how they would change if we intervene. And if we want to improve online platforms, ultimately, my argument is that we need to know that. It's not sufficient to just describe what's going on in these platforms. Okay, so now that I set my agenda, let me talk about today's menu. Hopefully, the appetizer was tasty enough and I was able to convince you that researchers should care about content curation in online platforms. And I'm going to present two projects related to one of the main ways in which platforms curate content, which is content moderation. I'm going to talk about moderating comments on Facebook. Then I'm going to talk about deplatforming. And finally, I'm going to close things off with my vision for future work on this area. Hopefully, as I do that, I can try to convey a bit of the way I like to do research. I really like research that can actually provide actionable insights. I like collaborating with industry and academia. I like to draw causal conclusions. And oftentimes we cannot run experiments on those things. So we have to actually draw causal conclusions by finding natural experiments from observational data. And hopefully you get a sense of how this looks like as I describe these two research projects. So let me give you a concrete example that puts everything we talked about in practice. One of the biggest challenges of online platforms is the proliferation of harmful, mean, toxic content. This kind of content makes interacting on the platform less desirable and is also illegal in many countries. But the problem here is that there's too much work for human moderators to detect and delete all harmful content. And therefore, platforms use automated systems to enforce rules, right? So Facebook, for example, automatically deletes certain harmful comments. And if you keep posting such comments, your account might be restricted or even banned. And back in 2021, I was under this Meta fellowship and I became an intern and a contractor at Facebook. And one thing that astounded me was that they did not have a good answer to a very fundamental question, which was, does automatic content moderation improve user behavior, right? So actually, when you're removing content from users, does this make users behave better in the long run? And in an ideal world, we would be able to run a randomized controlled experiment here, right? Every time a user posted a comment, we would be able to flip a coin and decide whether the comment is deleted or not. And we could compare the downstream behavior of users in the control and the treatment condition, right? To just dissect what is the effect of moderating content. But what I came to realize is that running such a randomized experiment in a place like Facebook is very tricky. First, there's a lot of harm that you would cause in a platform the size of Facebook, and it's very hard to control this harm when you choose not to delete some harmful comments, right? But second, there's this very, very strong resistance against running experiments and being a part of experiments within companies. So there's this case from the Facebook emotion study. So Facebook really doesn't want to run experiments on people, which personally, I think it's a bad thing. I think we should be running way more experiments, but it is what it is, right? And I'll be happy to discuss this in the Q&A. But the question here is like, what should we do, right? Should we just give up? And I guess, like, of course, we shouldn't, because otherwise I would not be talking about it, right? But more broadly, I would argue that figuring out what to do here is extremely important, because most of the data that we have is not experimental data, is what I would call found data. It's data that generated by the world taking its messy course, full of confounds and biases. And to get that, we basically have to assume that that we cannot do a randomized experiment. But now the question becomes, but what can we do, right? So let's begin by thinking on what would happen if we did the naive thing and simply looked at correlation. In this case, we could just, for example, look at comments that were auto-deleted and comments that were not auto-deleted and compare users posting these comments. And the problem here is that in this case, we might be really measuring the difference between harmful and harmless users. Because these two types of users who get their comments deleted and users who do not get their comments deleted, are very different. So this won't cut it, right? And here's the coolest part of doing this kind of research. To draw causal conclusions from observational data often requires us to find ways in which the data approximates an experiment. This is not trivial. It's very context specific, and it gives you this aha moment, which I hope to share with you all today. So let's see how Facebook actually decides whether to auto-delete a comment. They do so with a machine learning classifier, which scores each comment on a continuous scale from 0 to 1, where 0 means that the comment is not harmful at all, and 1 means that the comment is most harmful. And to decide which comments to delete, Facebook resorts to a threshold, such that if comments are above this threshold, they are deleted. And if comments are below this threshold, they're kept, they're published. And so far, we've gained nothing, right? I'm just explaining to you how this system works. But here's something neat. The threshold provides a discontinuity that locally, it splits the data essentially at random. Comments with scores just below or just above the threshold are very similar in all regards, but they receive very different treatments. One of them is kept, the one below the threshold, and the other one, the one above, is deleted. So this setup has essentially the same structure as a randomized experiment, as long as we focus around the threshold. In other words, the discontinuity at the threshold gives us something very close to a randomized experiment. It gives us a natural experiment for free, right, in the data that we already have. And now that we got the gist of it, of what is this natural experiment, I must confess that I lied, right? So like there's something fundamentally untrue of what I said before. And this is that the decisions are not made deterministically at the threshold. Reality is a bit more complicated because most social media platforms do not have a single automated process that governs all deletions with a single threshold. For a given classifier with a threshold T, the probability of deletion looks more like this. On the x-axis, we have the score that comments received, centered around the threshold. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of deletion given the score. Remember, the score is about how toxic a comment is. And if this was deterministic, this would look like a step function. The probability of deletion would be 0 if the score is smaller than the threshold, and then it would jump to 1. But it turns out that when S is smaller than T, you actually have other mechanisms that might delete the comment. You know, there's not a single classifier running on Facebook. There's a bunch of classifiers. So maybe another classifier will delete your comment here. But to my great surprise, also when the comment receives a score above the threshold, there's also a chance it doesn't get deleted. And this happens because on Facebook, there's actually classifiers that fish out comments and prevent these comments from getting deleted. So you don't have this very discrete transition between not deleted and deleted comments, but you still have this discontinuity, right? You have this fuzzy discontinuity. And we can still use this setup as a natural experiment using a methodology called fuzzy regression discontinuity design. And for that, we need two things. The first is what I just showed you. We need this discontinuity around the probability of treatment. we want this gap here, which I'll write as the simple equation, right? We want the difference between the expected value of X, which is the probability of deletion, just after minus just before the threshold. Okay, so essentially this gap. And the second thing we want is an outcome, right? We want to study the effect of this deletion on how users behave. So let's consider that 0 is the day when a user posts a comment near the threshold. And we need to establish some sort of follow-up period, like let's say 28 days. And we essentially have to calculate some outcome in this period. So, for example, one meaningful outcome that we can look at here is the number of subsequent deleted comments in this follow-up period, meaning after users post a comment that it's around the threshold, do they break the rules again? Do they continue to publish harmful comments? And let's remember that the idea is to contrast this outcome for users whose original comment made on day 0 was just after the threshold with users whose original comment was just before the threshold. And we can summarize this outcome with a similar graph, right? On the y-axis here, we have the outcome we talked about, which I'll call y. And on the x-axis, we have the score. And here again, we see a gap. And this gap is related to the effect of the intervention. Prior to the threshold and after the threshold, you can see that the outcome is changing very smoothly. But then you have this big jump right at the threshold. And what is happening there? The intervention. And again, the other thing that we want in fuzzy regression discontinuity is this gap in this outcome graph, right? This orange gap that I'm showing here. And the big insight of this method is that we can use the ratio between these two gaps to estimate the causal effect. More specifically, the local average treatment effect around the cutoff or the threshold, which we call LATEC, right? And it makes total sense if you think about it. We get how much the outcome changed around the threshold and divide it by the percentage of units we treated, right? And we can estimate this with a two-stage least square regression. We simply fit these two linear models, one capturing y as a function of s and the other one capturing x as a function of s. And each of these models has a baseline, a trend, and a coefficient associated with this dummy variable. And when you fit these models, you're essentially capturing the size of these gaps that I'm showing. And some, like econometrics aside, you have a sound way of estimating the causal effect here, right? Of saying when some comment gets deleted, what changes into this outcome? And I use this study design to analyze almost 500 million Facebook comments posted between June and August of 2022 in partnership with Meta, right? Like that's the only way you get access to this kind of data. And specifically, we measure the effect of the violence and incitement classifier, which is one of the 3 main classifiers that was used at Facebook at the time I was there. And we considered 2 outcomes, right? So we considered the number of comments in the follow-up period. So just like how this content moderation actually impacts subsequent user activity on the platform. And the second one is the outcome that I talked about before, which is the number of deleted comments in the follow-up period. The number of comments where, again, the platform had to delete something, right? Due to any sort of classifier, not only the violence and incitement classifier. And we found very clearly that auto-deletes reduce engagement transiently. So here in this plot, I'm showing the standardized effect on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, I'm showing different follow-up periods. So I'm showing what's the effect if we follow users for 7 days. What's the effect if we follow up users for 14 days? What's the effect if we follow up users for 21 days and 28 days? And these periods are overlapping, right? So basically what we find is that right after the comment gets deleted, people use perhaps Facebook a bit less, but on the long run, this doesn't happen at all, right? So users use Facebook in about the same, regardless of whether you delete their comments. So then you have this pattern of decreasing, then returning. But on the other hand, if we look at the harmfulness, the subsequent harmfulness of users, we find that there is a sustained decrease in the long term, right? In 28 days. So even though users go back to posting very similar, like users that get their comments deleted, go back to posting similar in similar rates to users that did not get their posts deleted, these users actually engage in harmful speech way less afterwards. Which on the paper, like this is a paper published at www in 2023, and there we actually looked at this thread level of like seeing how deleting a comment influences a conversation between multiple parties. And there we found evidence of contagion, meaning that not only deleting a comment prevents the user from breaking the rules, but it prevents other users from breaking the rules, right? So you can imagine you having this keyboard fight happening, and someone writes a like rude comment and it gets deleted right away. This prevents perhaps the fight from escalating even further. And in a nutshell, then, this work shows that auto-deletions work. And this paper, in my opinion, is a good example of kind of like the impact of research on content moderation, because we established this new way of evaluating content moderation with all the experiments, right? But second, because this work has had real impact inside of Meta or Facebook. Beyond this key finding, right? Like it has changed the way that people think about content moderation in some teams there. Before, they used to care about things like precision and recall and like how good the classifiers are. But now they also consider how this classifier is changing user behavior within the platform. And I think that's changes kind of like where the conversation must go when it comes to designing better platforms. To briefly mention, beyond deletions in other projects, I have also studied other content moderation practices, in particular around online communities. In a 2022 Facebook paper, I also studied how moderators use a feature called post approvals in Facebook groups. This feature requires each and every post to be reviewed by a moderator before they land into the group's feed. And for instance, there we found that this feature enabling post approvals makes Facebook groups centered around fewer, higher engagement posts, right? And more recently, I was fortunate to help design and test a new intervention called post guidance, which was deployed at Reddit, and I think it has become a Reddit feature by now, where the idea here is to provide feedback on whether a rule is being broken as users prepare the submission. So if you're familiar with Reddit, maybe you've seen Automod. This is kind of like a live version of Automod that tries to see if your post breaches the community guidelines as you're writing it and gives you a warning as to why your post is breaching community guidelines. And I believe that, frankly, there's a lot of fun work to be done here. We know less than we should about how existing content curation and content moderation practices shape our online platforms. And there's huge opportunity to design new interventions. And maybe these interventions, like the ones I just talked about, they might seem inconsequential, but I would argue that in aggregate, right, they shape online platforms. And at the same time, you could have other types of interventions that can single-handedly alter our information systems. For example, like when Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, right? And this is the flavor of the second project that I'm going to talk about, because I'm going to talk about the platforming. And the platforming is this umbrella term that has been broadly used to refer to banning acts from social media, right? And there's a big complicated debate around whether and when it should be done, with proponents arguing that it can improve online spaces and opponents worrying about the potential for censorship and that the measure might be ineffective. And as a researcher, I think that the best way to help society decide what should be done about it is to clarify what exactly is the effect of this practice. But before going there, let me give you a crash course on the platforming in case you're planning to be deplatformed in the next few weeks. Let me talk about how it usually goes. And I'll use Parler as a case study, since it will also be what the paper will talk about later on. And for those who do not know, Parler is a social media platform that was particularly popular around 2020, around Trump's election, among Trump supporters. So the way that the platforming usually goes is that there's some sort of event. The event here was January 6th and the invasion of the US Capitol. This event increases attention towards the deplatformed entity. In the running example, all eyes went to Parler since it played a crucial role during January 6th. And then finally, the platforming happened, caused both by the event and also by the increased attention that the event has brought to the platform. And here, Parler was banned from the app stores and, most important, from Amazon AWS. And the whole social media platform simply disappeared into thin air, right? Like it used to be a thing, and then suddenly it wasn't a thing. And again, the big question here is, does the platforming work, right? Does the platforming, and let me be specific here and narrow down what I mean by work. Does the platforming changes the kind of content that Parler users consumed? Or like you had Parler users that were consuming this kind of content, and then you banned Parler. Did they change the kind of content that they consumed? Or did they just flock to similar platforms like Gab, Rumble, and 4chan and consume very similar content, right? And I'm calling all these platforms here that I'm showing in the slide broadly fringe platforms in opposition to mainstream platforms like Facebook or YouTube that have much stricter moderation guidelines. And again, once more, we could imagine a randomized experiment, right, that would allow us to answer this question. It's a bit absurd, but let's entertain it, right? Whenever there was a rule-breaking incident, Amazon AWS, let's assume that they host everyone, could flip a coin, right? Like Jeff Bezos himself could go there, flip a coin, and decide whether to ban this platform or not. And we would compare consumption of fringe platforms in general among times when these platforms were banned and times when these platforms were not banned. And I guess here, I don't need you to convince that this experiment is unfeasible or impossible, right? And you can just imagine how happy like regulators and everyone would be that these high-stake decisions are made by the flip of a coin, right? Like this is not how the world works. So the question then is, should we give up? And again, I would argue that no, right? Because in this case, it's not that we don't want to run an experiment for ethical questions or for because people dislike this kind of experiments, but rather that like we cannot run the experiment. But still, answering this kind of question is crucial if we want to have a debate around what should we do? Should we deplatform or should we not deplatform? Is this effective? Should we spend energy there? And so on. So again, let's see if we can find some neat way to extract causality from observational data. And again, let's assume that we cannot run a randomized experiment, and let's see what would go wrong if we did the simplest thing and looked at correlation. If we looked at a pre versus post correlational study. We could simply measure attention across a variety of fringe platforms before and after the whole thing happened, right? Before and after January 6th and the platforming happened. And we could capture this delta, which is the difference in attention before and after. Because this delta is triggering is capturing the effect, but this won't work, right? Like the bottom line is this won't work. And why won't it work? Because this delta is capturing the effect of the platforming and the effect of the event that triggered the platforming. So we cannot say, like perhaps, for example, the platforming had a negative effect, but the event that triggered the platforming actually significantly boosted attention towards fringe platforms. And in total, you would see an increase, and you would wrongly conclude that the platforming doesn't work, but when it does, right? So you just can't draw this kind of conclusion from this kind of data. But let's think about it, right? Like let's think about how we can decompose this attention that I'm talking about. Instead of thinking about this aggregate attention, let's split this attention, this time spent in these platforms by types of users, right? Let's denote users who before these events mainly used Parler as Parler users and users who mainly used other types of fringe social media platforms as fringe users. And let's call everyone else other users, okay? By definition, we can say that attention towards fringe platforms in general is nothing else than the attention of these three categories of users combined. But so far, this is nothing new, like we're just decomposing attention here, and we're just saying like this is another way of looking at attention. But here again, there's something neat we can do. We can focus on these first two categories of users, what I call parlor users and fringe users. Remember, both these users experience the platforming, right? So let's just do the same pre versus post for both these types of users. We'll get these users who we're calling parlor users, people who were very active on Parlor prior to the deplatforming, and we'll do the pre versus post differences in attention there. And we'll get this red delta. And then let's get these fringe users, users who were in other platforms like Gab, Rumble, 4chan, but not on Parlor prior to the banning. And let's see the difference in their attention pre versus post on the platform. And the key insight here is that, like these users are very similar in many ways, but for the red users, for the Parlor users, their platform was banned, right? So they lost their platform. So they have the effect of the event and the effect of the platform. But for the other types of users, for the orange users, for the fringe users, their platform was not banned. So changes in attention there come from the event. And the key insight of the method here that we'll use, called differences in differences, is that if we take this difference between the deltas, and if we assume that these things are linear, we can basically say that like, hey, I'm isolating the effect of the platforming because I'm getting people that experienced both these things, the platforming and the event, and subtracting the effect from people that observed only the event. And with this, we can get a causal effect of the platforming. So again, if we focus on this very specific type of user, and if we interpret the data correctly, we get something very close to a real experiment for free. We get a natural experiment once again. But before I talk about the study of the results, I need to clarify something here again, which is I've been talking about attention or online attention all the time here. And these are things like page views, daily active users, and time spent. And these are very common metrics in companies like Meta or Google, but they're very rare in academia because getting access to this kind of data is very hard. And to my great fortune, I came across Duncan and Oma, great collaborators who had access to data from the Nielsen company. Yeah, the Nielsen responsible for TV tracking happens to have this massive online panel with over 100,000 panelists. And they do not only have access to the full web history and app usage for these users, but they also have socioeconomic characteristics like their income, their age, their gender, and so on. And this data has several advantages over traditional social media data that typically we do research on. First is cross-platform, meaning that we can actually capture how users are migrating across these different platforms, which is very important for the question that we want to answer. But second, that this data captures passive engagement. It doesn't necessarily captures it's not necessarily capturing comments or likes, but it's capturing time spent. And this is a very good thing here, right? So armed with this data and with the differences in differences methodology that I talked about, we went on to study the effect of the platforming Parlor on online attention. We study around 1,000 panelists, and this is a matched sample composed of users with similar socioeconomic characteristics, but half of them mostly consumed Parlor before the intervention, and the other half mostly consumed other fringe platforms. And our key outcome here is attention. And I'm going to show plots related to the daily active use of different sets of social media websites. So I'm going to show the daily active use of Parlor, of other fringe social media platforms, and this is basically all fringe social media platforms except for Parlor. And I'm going to show aggregate consumption across all social media platforms in the form of daily active use. And let me show you how one of these outcomes look like through time. So on the x-axis here, I have the date, and on the y-axis, I have the percentage of daily active users for treatment and control users. And here, what we can see is that you have this is how much users in the treatment and control group are consuming other fringe social media platform. So here, for example, I can see that consumption on the control group has remained kind of stable, but that when we look at Parler users, they suddenly, after the ban of Parler, just all of them jumped to other free social media platforms. And again, like we can use this data to calculate the deltas that we talked about and get a measure of the causal effect, right? So here you would assume that the causal effect is positive, right? Because the red delta is much bigger than the orange delta. But what did we find, right? So, and here I'm going to show the aggregate treatment effects that we estimated. First, we can look at the consumption of other fringe social media. And here I'm splitting the panelists between the results between the panelists for whom we had mobile data versus desktop data. Note that the platforming increased the consumption of social media, fringe social media platforms, other fringe social media platforms by more or less 13 percentage points. Next, we can look at what happened to Parler usage, right? And unsurprisingly, consumption of Parler decreased, which is what you would expect, right? Like the platform disappeared, you expect consumption to decrease. But ultimately, what we want to ask is what happens when we consider all platforms altogether, when we consider both Parler and all the other kind of like fringe platforms environment. And there we actually find that nothing changed, right? So this offset, this migration of these users to other platforms completely offsets the decrease in the time that participants spend in Parler. And here I'm showing the plots for daily active use, but we also find the same results for time spent. So when you look at time spent across these platforms, we find the same thing, right? So the too long didn't read here is that the platforming Parler did not work. And I think that this has a strong policy implication, is that the isolated platforming of a major fringe platform is not an effective way to reduce overall user activity in this kind of social media, right? And I think that this methodology to evaluate the platforming could actually be applied to many other events of the kind. And we should do it, right? Like we have the data at hand, these panels exist. This is something that I think we should do to understand how these big decisions impact our information environment. But it's worth noting that the platforming, again, it's this umbrella term, is no single intervention. And in other work, I also explored the impact of the platforming online communities or influencers. And surprisingly, the effects differ, you know? So banning online communities does reduce activity in these online communities if they are on mainstream platforms. Banning influencers from mainstream platforms does reduce engagement with these influencers. But there are side effects, right? Like these users go to other platforms. But in general, I would argue that the heterogeneity of effects here is a reason why we need research to study content curation, because these are complex systems, and figuring out what are the consequences of interventions within them is no simple task, and things are going to vary, right? So coming back to the start, I hope these two projects I presented give you a good idea of how we can understand the causal effect of content curation practices. But still, a question you might all ask is like, why should we do this work in academia? Why shouldn't, like if you're interested in this, why shouldn't you go to TikTok or Meta or YouTube? And, like companies like Meta and Google are full of brilliant researchers in trust and safety teams where they work around topics that are very relevant to society. They have access to abundant data, but I would still argue that they have poorly aligned incentives, right? These companies have been unable to tackle these problems by themselves. And this is because some of the ways to fix these online platforms are not perhaps the ways of making them more profitable. But I would argue that this misalignment also happens in subtle ways. Promotions or bonuses or prestige within these companies are more tied to creating new products or tweaking features so that they attract more users and more money. But also another problem with these platforms is that they care about their own products. They lack this systemic view. A lot of these questions, they concern not a single platform, but a plethora of platforms or multiple platforms, just like in the deplatforming project. And in academia, we kind of have the flipped scenario, right? So we have well-aligned incentives, and I would say we have a better systemic view of the whole thing, but we have poor access to data and experiments. And solving this, It's something that I've started as I just joined as faculty. It's something that I've been thinking a lot. We need new ways of obtaining data, right? Like we can't rely on APIs any longer. These things are not like they are being deprecated, and it's hard to do research with them. For example, I've been working with a Swiss NGO that provides open source software to tweak recommendations on YouTube. And, like I'm experimenting with models of data sharing and with browser extensions and so on. I also think that we're living through a causal revolution, and these methods that I used, they're getting more and more advanced. We have better ways of drawing causal conclusions from observational data. And we should continue exploring that. And last, I think that we need to find new models to collaborate with industry, right? Europe is being shaken by the Digital Services Act, where companies may or are like, I think it's approved now. So companies will be required to share data with researchers. And I truly hope that this sparks a new era for collaborations with industry. And companies will have to set up the infrastructure to share data, right? So we might as well get them as well in the US. Another direction I want to pursue is more related to AI. And, as new technologies like LLMs are developed and become popular, they'll bring a lot of challenges to online platforms, but they also may enable new content creation practices and new ways of studying online platforms. For example, Facebook, it gave you this very generic notice of deleting your comment. But what if this can be personalized? What if this can be tailored to different users? This is well within the reach of current language models. And on a more fundamental level, I think that there's a chance that LLMs change how we study human behaviors. And, there's this promise of silicon samples of trying to, you can see that this talk was from my job market talk from this slide. So that gives it the hint. But more broadly, there's a huge promise in trying to simulate human behavior with LLMs and try to facilitate the workflow of experiments by, for example, piloting experiments and trying to figure out what's the best way to run these experiments by running things in advance with language models. One concrete application of this kind of like silicon sampling of this behavior simulation I'm particularly interested is to create better algorithmic audits. Like on that PNAS paper that I talked at the very beginning of the presentation, we talked about the effect of YouTube's algorithm, right? Like, how do we even measure that, right? We created this thing called counterfactual bots. We used real YouTube histories like the one I'm showing. This is my own history at some point. And we basically created these control bots that would simply watch the kinds of videos that I watched, and they would collect what kind of content I was being recommended. And we would also instantiate these counterfactual bots, which would, in the first moment, do exactly the same as the control bot and follow my trajectory through YouTube. But then at a certain point, just follow the algorithm blindly. And, by comparing this, like the kind of recommendation that you get in these two scenarios, you can actually disentangle what is the effect of the algorithm here. But the point here is not this. The point is that this is super expensive to do and hard, and you have to, do all sorts of like crazy things and get access to panel data to do. But what if we could have some sort of LLM powered audits, right? What if we can, in many cases, we actually want to study vulnerable populations and, like, for instance, children, how children use social media. What if we can get more realistic models of how children use social media to actually study the harms on them, right, which are severely understudied. Or what if we can use this to expose these silicon samples to radical content, right, like something we will never be able to do in a real experiment with humans because of the harm. So I think that there's a lot of excitement around here, but there's also a lot of potential harm brought forth by these new technologies, right? So for instance, there is huge concern around the potential harms of AI-generated misinformation and disinformation, which may be overblown, right? But like increasingly, I personally don't think it is, having been a part of a lot of projects studying the persuasiveness of language models and so on. And I think that going forward, we need to find ways of realistically assess those risks And those risks will often involve online platforms and the design of online platforms. So very briefly, like we actually did a first dip in evaluating this. This has actually just been released at the communications of the ACM. And there's huge concern around, for instance, to which extent crowd workers in platforms like Mechanical Turk or Prolific are using LLMs to answer, because people use these platforms to study human behavior, right? But what if now like psychologists using these platforms are actually studying LLM behavior or how ChatGPT answers questions? This is like very suboptimal. And when you talk about this, researchers are super concerned, right? Like, so this paper has gotten incredible coverage. And I think it's because everyone is kind of freaked out over what's going to happen once these models become more and more powerful, given that they're accessible to everyone and given that they fundamentally change our information environment. But there's so much more to do here, right? How will these models change social media now that people can increasingly smart edit pictures to change how they look or how crowded places are? How will it change peer reviewing, right? Now that AI can write something that resembles like a review, and it's very hard to tell them apart. Or when you go to online marketplaces, like unless the review starts with as an AI language model, like you can actually write convincing reviews. The cost of generating coherent sounding text is gone, and like how will this impact the world? I think that these is like very exciting, and it's the new frontier for people studying harms and content moderation and content curation. Because I strongly believe that online platforms are the number one place where this will have tremendous impact, and it's already having tremendous impact, right? Like go to TikTok, what percentage of videos you're scrolling through contain a voiceover, some random AI generated image, and automated captions, right? Like it has already shaped the way that we consume content. So I hope you enjoyed today's talk. And if there's something that was too hard to chew during this, here you can find it packed for the takeaway. So I've tried to present research that shows that we can improve online platforms by understanding content creation practices. And fundamentally, and by understanding, I mean to use causal inference and machine learning and network analysis to try to get insights on how these things work. Everything was presented was only possible due to my amazing collaborators, which are spread all over the place. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
All right, questions, comments, thoughts people want to share, get feedback on? Okay, let me just run across the front.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Absolutely wonderful, and this is one of the more insightful ones that I've found. I was wondering if there's ever been a time where you have had conflicting outcomes in your research that's not desirable to industry, or that industry may have objection towards, especially nowadays with new policies that are being implemented. So I was wondering, how do you counter when industry doesn't necessarily like your research or may not find it beneficial to implement?
Yeah, that's a great point. Like in my experience working with research was very particular to the experience of a PhD student working with research, in the sense that I think that a lot of the risk that I had was mitigated by the fact that like I did the whole thing, and at the end there was some sort of like very obscure process of approval that can absolutely kill your research, right? So in that sense, the risk is mitigated at the end. I do feel that companies are relatively willing to change their policies, given that research was done internally to show something. Like to me, the greater harm and the greater risk is that the incentives for this kind of research to be conducted within the companies is very small, right? So ultimately, like if you work at Meta, if you work at Google, you want to file kind of like your end of quarter report, and the more you can tie it to financial gains or to like concrete money, like the best. And I think that this can slowly across cycles and across reorgs clash down initiatives that are aimed at making environments pro-social. Like they do exist within the companies, but they're the first one to be thrown with the by the window, like when the times are tougher. So in that sense, on a kind of like continuous collaboration level, I think that's something that would be more scalable. It's something like the DSA, where researchers essentially have mandated access through law, and companies have to comply to some extent. I think that would be a better model on the long run. That being said, I think a very strong force within these companies is actually that people that are in these companies are like often like doing research. In particular, they are people that were in academia just the other day. They're excited just as you to do it. This is interesting to them, so they have some sort of internal motivation that drives them. And I think that a lot of the good things that come from this internal motivation of trying to change things, rather than like the financial incentives and so on and so forth. So I kind of sideline your question, but I agree with you, right? Like it's not scalable, and we have to find ways around it, either pragmatically through trying to work with them, or in more systematic ways by trying to implement mechanisms to get this data.
I appreciate it. It was mostly just because I was wondering, there's a lot of policies, there's a lot of things where recently, like, for example, the government or certain CEOs have been kind of stepping in and saying, do this, do that, and whether research could rather apply to that, or research could kind of discover certain flaws or certain benefits to certain policies, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you so much. That mostly answered my question.
Hi. I really liked your auto deletion paper. Big fan of it. And I have a question actually about like one of your earlier questions that like I wonder your sort of like future takes on like how you can do these type of social computing experiments. So because like there's also this other force kind of just like using generative agents to simulate your participants or simulate personas. And I'm wondering like because you're looking at building like an infrastructure for testing or finding the inference effects on these, experiments. I'm wondering like, do you see a way that we can really like merge something that's, along the lines of agents into these infrastructures? Or, do you feel like it's mostly still that we need to ground it like in just metrics, observations, and experiment designs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel that like when it comes to like, there's two angles to this. The first one is that I feel that there's an idea of trying to streamline the process of running these experiments and to try to find things that are more likely to work through some sort of agent-based thing. Ultimately, I don't think we can replace experiments, right? Like that's what we want to study. One angle that could be interesting is trying to think of this as a forecasting problem, right? Where you have a bunch of experiments, and given that your agents can simulate the outcomes of enough experiments well enough, you can have with some confidence, some certainty that some other experiments that you have not yet run would provide some sort of like you could trust the findings on the agent setup, right? But like ultimately, I think that there's this notion of ground truth of running the real experiment and trying to get an estimate. Like we can't escape that, right? And the idea here is really can we use this as a way to streamline our experiments, right? Like because running an experiment is super expensive, right? There's this notion of like it's kind of like this extremely way of getting an extremely silly yes or no question. You have to spend all this money and like involve all these people to run a single randomized control trial. So the question here is like, can we find which questions to ask, or can we streamline the whole process and better measure power analysis with agents and so on? So I think that it's very kind of like supportive of the experimental pipeline that we must have, but I'm skeptical of like just running this on agents, right? I think that this must be in complement rather than in replacement to the work that is already being done with people, because otherwise you have this problem where if you already know what's going on, there's no sense in simulating with agents. Like you already know, like you're just confirming what you know. If you don't know what's going on, like you won't know whether the results you're getting are valid because you don't have ground truth, right? So we always have this problem. So you have to treat it as a forecasting thing, right? As a prediction thing. And maybe you can get a good sense of how accurate these predictions are of human behavior. And if they're pretty accurate, maybe they're good enough for some things, but they won't be the gold standard that we want to have for sure. So that's my perspective on this. In terms of other infrastructure that I'm very excited about, and maybe this also relates a bit to the earlier question, I think it's also like we should try to get data. Like, I think that not only like the infrastructure that we should build should not only be LLMs and agents, right? But finding alternative ways to get data as researchers through data donations, through browser extensions, through panels, right? There's the National Internet Observatory Initiative in the US, for instance, is trying to build a representative panel of user behavior online. So like we must resort to building our own infrastructure on top of what already exists. And maybe we can, if we cannot run experiments, on Facebook, we can run experiments there, right? And perhaps these experiments are LLM enhanced, if you will, right?
I say makes sense. A lot of like unknowns there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we might have time for one more, if there's anyone with a question. I'm not seeing any takers. So if you don't mind, I will actually ask a question. So you had this kind of like, I think mildly hot take early on in your talk about this idea that like, hey, companies now are very cautious about running experiments because of bad press that they've gotten in the past. And like, it seemed like you were arguing like we should be actually doing a lot more of those. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, that's a hot take. Like because I feel it's a very weird thing, right? So there's even papers about it. Duncan Watts has a paper about it. Like people really dislike being in an experiment, even if they think that both the experimental conditions are fine. So essentially the problem is being in an experiment. And companies run experiments on us all the time, right? Like everything is A/B tested. And basically like we don't have access to these A/B tests, right? Like we're being guinea pigs, we're being experiments. But we cannot control, and they're in full power to do that. But still, when you have something like the Facebook emotional contagion experiment, right, which is something that companies do all the time, like they tweak their feeds to be better or worse. But when there's this kind of like eyes of the beholder of people trying to look for something, there's huge scrutiny of people, right? And there's this idea of the experimenting society, right, where like part of like we don't know of like. I think that one approach I appreciate is this idea that we don't know exactly what is best in all scenarios, and we should probably experiment with some things, right? So in that sense, experimentation will be kind of like a civic duty, right? Of like trying to figure out what works best or what works worse. And this is not the case, right? Like it's the opposite. Like people really dislike being in there because they're being manipulated. And I think that if we want, like everyone wants social media to be better, everyone wants a lot of things, but we won't get there if we're not able to tweak and make mistakes and experiment. So I think that there's very little openness towards that in society in general, and a lot of resistance towards that. And this makes it harder to come up with solutions very easily, because if we're not able to experiment, we're able to ask less of these what if questions, and we'll peek into fewer kind of like futures that of how things could be, right? So it is a hot take, and like I understand that there is abuse in experimenting in many cases, but in many cases I feel that we're very hesitant to do experiments online when the harms are actually very small. Like like disabling Facebook feed does very little, like as a science paper tells us. And and we're very bold. Like a lot of the good that comes in the world, for instance in medicine, comes from the fact that we're actually very bold in experimenting, right? Because we have a very direct connection to the outcome. So if you suffer from a severe disease, you might like put yourself in danger to test a new drug that can have horrible side effects, that can kill you, that can like have all these things, because it gives you a chance of surviving and of achieving a better outcome. And without this, we wouldn't have had tremendous progress in cancer research, in all sorts of areas of rare diseases and so on, where essentially progress has been tremendous over the past like 50, 60 years. So that's my hot take.
So much, Manuel. Let's give a final round of applause as a thank you for
Thank you very much.
speaking today.
Thank you.
And we will hopefully be able to bring you in person again sometime soon.
Amazing. Thank you, Kristen.